The dog had already put 2 people in the hospital, 110 pounds of military-trained Belgian Malinois, 6 days without food, locked inside an isolation room at Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Colorado Springs. And the only thing standing between him and a lethal injection was a signed destruction order sitting on the desk of a man who'd never once set foot near a combat zone. Everyone in that emergency wing had tried. Veterans, K-9 handlers, a specialist flown in from Fort Carson, every single one walked out bleeding or rattled. Then a nurse nobody recognized showed up. Worn jacket, no fanfare, badge still being processed. The screaming stopped before she even touched the door. If this story pulls you in, stay until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The call went out at 6:42 in the morning. Not over the intercom. Those had been disabled 20 minutes earlier after the first incident, when Ranger had launched himself against the reinforced door hard enough to crack the observation window. The call went out the old way. Mouth to ear, floor to floor, the kind of urgent whisper that moved faster through a hospital hallway than any announcement system ever built. Don't go near Isolation Ward B. Don't ask questions. Just stay away. By the time Nurse Petra Calloway arrived for her shift at Harlow Veterans Medical Center, the story had already mutated into 3 different versions. In the first version, the dog had bitten a handler so badly the man needed 6 stitches across his palm. In the second version, it was 12 stitches and a fractured wrist. By the third version, there had been blood on the walls and someone had quietly thrown up in the staff bathroom afterward. Petra didn't know which version was true. She didn't particularly want to find out. She clocked in, pulled her hair back, and went to check on her patients in the post-op recovery ward. A retired Army sergeant named Dubois, who complained about everything except the pain, and a young National Guard kid, barely 22, who never complained about anything at all. That was her morning. That was supposed to be her whole day. She was refilling Dubois' water pitcher when she heard the voice from the hallway. Not loud, not demanding, just clear. I need to see whoever's in charge of the K-9 situation. Petra looked up. Through the narrow window in the recovery room door, she caught a glimpse. A woman, maybe early 30s, standing at the nurse's station in a gray jacket that had clearly been washed too many times. Dark hair pulled back. A visitor's badge clipped crooked to her collar, the kind they printed out at the front desk for people who hadn't been formally processed yet. She was carrying a plain black bag over one shoulder, and she was looking at the charge nurse behind the desk with the kind of patient, unblinking focus that made people uncomfortable without raising a single voice. The charge nurse, Kevin, 26 years old, 8 months on the job, glanced up from his screen and then back down again like she wasn't there. "Ma'am, this isn't really a public area." "I'm not public." She set a folded paper on the counter. "I'm the civilian trauma assignment from Regional Command. I was told to report directly to the emergency wing." Kevin picked up the paper, looked at it, set it back down without reading it properly. "There's a process for credentialing. You'd need to check in with HR. I checked in with HR at 6:15. They told me to come here." A beat. "I've been standing at this desk for 4 minutes. Kevin opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his phone. Petra went back to Dubois' water pitcher. Charset. Her name, as Petra would learn later, was Mara Voss. She found this out not from any formal introduction, but from the argument that broke out in the hallway outside the nursing station approximately 12 minutes after Mara had presented her paperwork. It wasn't a loud argument. It was the specific kind of low-pitched, controlled disagreement between professionals who both believed they were right and neither of whom wanted to make a scene in a medical facility, which somehow made it worse than shouting. Dr. Callum Reeves, the attending physician for the emergency wing, had the particular talent of making any sentence sound like a final decision. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with the kind of thick graying hair that looked good on television and the kind of institutional authority that had never once been seriously challenged. He ran the emergency wing of Harlow Veterans like it was a military operation, which the veterans appreciated even if his bedside manner occasionally reminded people of a particularly impatient general. "I appreciate you making the trip," he said, in a tone that made clear he appreciated nothing about it. "But we have a protocol situation here that's beyond civilian trauma management. The K-9 unit has already contacted their handlers through official..." The K-9 unit called Fort Bragg this morning, Mara said. Fort Bragg called Regional Command. Regional Command sent me. She paused. I'm not jumping a queue, Dr. Reeves. I'm the end of the queue. The animal is a medical liability at this point. There's already paperwork. I know about the paperwork. Then you understand why we're past the intervention stage. I understand that the dog has been in isolation for 6 days. He hasn't eaten since his handler died, and every attempt to reach him has involved restraint equipment and raised voices. Her tone didn't change. It didn't need to. I'm asking for a different approach. Reeves looked at her the way men like him looked at anyone who hadn't yet learned where the boundaries were. Patient, slightly amused, already dismissing the conversation as something he'd need to manage rather than engage with. What's your background in veterinary trauma? It's not veterinary. Then what exactly? Human trauma, combat recovery, some crossover work. She picked up her bag. Let me see the room. No one has seen that room without clearance from... I have clearance. She said it quietly. Check your email. There was a pause. Reeves pulled out his phone. Whatever he read on it, his expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A small recalibration, the kind people made when they realized the ground had shifted slightly under their feet. He looked up. I'll need someone with you. Fine. And you stay outside the door. To start. He didn't like that answer. But he didn't argue it. Petra wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Isolation Ward B. She had told herself this twice, very firmly, while walking in exactly that direction. Her official reason, the one she rehearsed in her head in case anyone asked, was that she needed to check the supply closet adjacent to the B ward corridor for a specific brand of wound dressing that post-op kept requisitioning and never receiving. This was technically true. It was also completely beside the point. She got to the corridor at 7:24 and stopped. The hallway outside Ward B was crowded in a way that hallways outside medical wards generally weren't. There were 4 staff members standing at what felt like a carefully negotiated safe distance from the isolation room door. A security officer with his arms crossed, Kevin from the nurses' station, who had apparently decided to follow the situation personally. A woman from hospital administration Petra vaguely recognized, clutching a clipboard like it was going to protect her. And then there was Mara Voss, sitting on the floor. Not standing, not pacing. Sitting on the linoleum floor of the hospital corridor with her back against the wall beside the isolation room door, her black bag beside her, her knees loosely bent, her hands resting open on her thighs. She wasn't doing anything. That was the part that made everyone uncomfortable. She wasn't reading. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't speaking through the door or making soothing sounds or doing any of the things you might expect from someone attempting animal intervention. She was simply there, still and quiet, like she had decided to become part of the architecture of the hallway. From inside the room, Petra could hear Ranger. She had heard dogs before, some family pets, the occasional therapy animal in the hospital's community program, a neighbor's shepherd that barked at everything that moved. This was not that sound. This was something older and rawer, a low vocalization that cycled between a growl and something almost like a moan. The sound of an animal in a state of ongoing internal war. The kind of sound that made the hair on your arms stand up and told every ancient instinct you had to back away slowly. The staff near the door had backed away. The security officer had backed away. Mara hadn't moved. She's been there for 20 minutes, Kevin murmured beside Petra, appearing from nowhere the way Kevin always seemed to. Is she? Petra started. Just sitting there. He shook his head. Dr. Reeves came by twice. She ignored him both times. Petra watched. From inside the room, the sound shifted. The cycling growl moan dropped in pitch and frequency. Not gone, but lower, like a volume dial turning by degrees. One of the staff members near the door, a male nurse named Gordon, who'd worked the veterans' wing for 9 years and prided himself on having seen everything, glanced at the others and said quietly, "Did it just get quieter?" Nobody answered him. Mara still hadn't moved. What? The first person to say something openly dismissive was Ren Nakamura, senior charge nurse for the emergency wing, who arrived at 7:51 having been paged by Kevin and apparently feeling strongly about the situation. Wren was efficient, experienced, and completely certain about most things. She had been at Harlow Veterans for 11 years. She had opinions about procedure, about hierarchy, and about what belonged in her wing and what didn't. "This is a medical facility," she said, standing over Mara with her arms folded. "Not a park bench." Mara looked up. "I know. Whatever approach you're using, it needs to be documented, cleared through." "It's not an approach yet." Mara's voice was even. "I'm just sitting here." "For 45 minutes. "Yes." Wren looked at the door, looked at Mara, looked at the growing cluster of staff in the hallway who were all pretending not to watch while watching intently. "I'm going to need you to move. You're creating a disruption. I'm sitting on a floor. People are stopping their rounds to stand here. That's not something I'm doing." Mara said it without heat, without edge, just a statement of fact. "I'm not performing for them. They can leave." Wren's expression did something complicated. "I'm going to have to call Dr. Reeves." "You already called him twice." A pause. "Excuse me?" "I heard the conversation the second time." Still calm. "He said to let it play out for another hour." Wren's mouth tightened. She glanced at Kevin, who suddenly found something very interesting to look at on his own shoes. "I want to be clear," Wren said, her voice dropping to the register it used when she was being clear, "that whatever happens in this wing is my responsibility. And you, she gestured at Mara, "are not in my chain of command." Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "No, I'm not." And that was all she said. Wren stood there for another few seconds, the way people did when they'd expected resistance and received none, and didn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. Then she turned and walked away, heels sharp on the linoleum. Petra stayed. She wasn't sure why. She had the wound dressing in her hand. She'd actually found it, purely by accident. And she had patients who needed her, and she had exactly zero professional reason to be standing in this hallway watching a woman sit on a floor outside a room that contained an animal that had put 2 people in the hospital. But she stayed. Because at 8:03, the sound from inside the room changed again. Not gone. Not better, exactly, but different in a way that was hard to articulate. Less like an engine at the edge of catastrophic failure, and more like something running very hard and beginning, just slightly, to slow down. And Mara, who had not moved in over an hour, turned her head toward the door. She didn't touch it, didn't open it, just turned her head like she was listening. And then, very quietly, she made a sound. Not words, not soothing murmurs. It was something short and low, a pattern of breath and tone that Petra had never heard before. 2 short beats and a long one, repeated twice. The corridor went absolutely silent. From behind the door, Ranger made a sound that Petra had never heard from a dog in her life. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a bark. It was something almost soft. A single vocalization, rough around the edges, like the first attempt at a word from someone who hadn't spoken in months. Mara closed her eyes, just for a second. Then she opened them and went back to sitting still. Gordon, the 9-year veteran, was staring at the door with an expression Petra had never seen on him before. "What was that?" someone whispered behind her. Nobody answered. Dr. Reeves returned at 8:30. He stood at the end of the corridor for a moment, taking in the scene, Mara on the floor, the cluster of transfixed staff, the clipboard from administration that had been set down on a chair sometime in the past hour because nobody was taking notes anymore. Then he walked the length of the hall and crouched down to Mara's level, which was the most physically uncomfortable thing Petra had seen him do in the months she'd worked at Harlow. "Report," he said. "He's not attacking the door anymore," Mara said. "Heart rate is probably still elevated. He's in a defensive grief spiral. Stimulus sensitivity is high, which is why restraint attempts made it worse. He's not dangerous, he's in pain." He put a handler in urgent care. The handler approached with a catchpole and a raised voice. Mara paused. "If you were 6 days into acute grief and someone came at you with a catchpole, you'd defend yourself too." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "The destruction order. Give me until the end of the day." He looked at her. "That's not how this facility... I know how this facility works." She met his eyes. "Give me until the end of the day." Petra watched Reeves's face do the same recalibrating thing it had done in the hallway earlier. The small, almost invisible shift of someone reassessing the landscape. He wasn't used to this specific kind of resistance. Not the aggressive kind, not the procedural kind. The quiet, immovable kind that didn't give him anything to push against. "You open that door," he said finally. "You're accepting full liability." "Understood. And you need a medical observer present, someone with documentation authority." He looked up, scanned the cluster of staff in the hallway. His gaze landed, after a moment's consideration, on Petra. Petra realized she was still holding the wound dressing. "Calloway," Reeves said, "you're observing." Petra blinked. "I have post-op patients. Dubois is stable and Reinhold is sleeping. You're observing." He stood. "Document everything. If anything escalates," he looked at Mara, "we pull back and I make the call." Mara nodded once. Reeves walked away. Petra stood there for a moment looking at the door, then at Mara, then at the door again. "Have you done this before?" she asked. Mara looked up at her. Something in her expression was difficult to read. Not unfriendly, but contained in a way that suggested there were rooms inside her that weren't on the public tour. "Yes," she said. "With dogs?" "With a lot of things." Petra looked at the door. Through it, she could hear Ranger. Quieter now, but still there, still cycling through that rough, low vocalization that set every nerve ending on edge. "He's going to be okay," Mara said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was delivered the way you delivered a clinical assessment, matter of fact, based on available information. "How do you know?" Mara stood up, picked up her bag, brushed off the back of her jacket with 2 quick swipes like someone who had sat on worse floors than this one. "Because he hasn't quit," she said. What happened when Mara opened the door was not what Petra expected. She had braced herself. She was not ashamed to admit this, standing back against the corridor wall with her pen and clipboard as Mara entered the access code that Reeves had sent via text and pushed open the heavy reinforced door. She had braced for the sound to explode outward, for the sprint of an animal launching itself at the intrusion, for the chaos that had characterized every other attempt to interact with Ranger in the past 6 days. Instead, there was a pause. The door opened. Mara stood in the threshold, not entering, not retreating, just occupying the space. The sound from inside the room dropped to almost nothing. Petra counted her own heartbeats. Got to 11 before anything happened. What happened was this. Ranger, and she could see him now, a large Malinois pressed into the far corner of the room, his body language a textbook illustration of fight-or-flight tension, lifted his head. He looked at Mara. Mara looked at him. She didn't make the sound again, didn't use any visible signal. She just stood there in the doorway in her 2-washed gray jacket, her bag over her shoulder, her hands at her sides. And Ranger, who had put a trained K9 handler in urgent care less than 18 hours ago, took 1 step toward the door. 1 step. Then stopped. "Don't move," Mara said quietly to Petra. Petra did not move. Mara sat down on the floor again, right there in the doorway, half in and half out of the isolation room, in a posture that looked relaxed and was probably the furthest thing from it, and she waited. Gordon appeared at Petra's shoulder from nowhere. "She's out of her mind," he breathed. "Probably," Petra whispered. They watched. Ranger stood in the middle of the room now. He'd moved from the corner without either of them seeing it happen. One moment he was pressed against the far wall, the next he was standing 8 feet from the door, his head lowered, his amber eyes fixed on Mara. His ears moved. His breath came in visible patterns, the ribs rising and falling with the effort of an animal running a long internal race. Mara reached into her bag. Petra felt Gordon tense beside her. What Mara pulled out was a sealed pack of veterinary-grade food, nothing dramatic about it, the kind that came from any halfway decent supply list. She opened it without ceremony and set it on the floor just inside the doorway, to her left, without looking at Ranger directly. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ranger sat down. Just sat. In the middle of the room. The defensive posture that had defined him for 6 days, the locked joints and the hair along his spine and the constant cycling vocalization dropped by visible degrees. Not gone, but reduced in a way that felt almost physical, like watching a pressure system finally, incrementally, begin to release. Ren Nakamura had come back. Petra registered her presence at the edge of the corridor without turning to look, and she heard the small sound Wren made. Not quite a word, not quite silence. Mara hadn't moved. "She's going to get herself killed," Wren said, very quietly, to no one in particular. Petra didn't answer, because Ranger had moved again. 2 steps toward the door, then 1 more. His nose dropped toward the food Mara had set down, and he stopped a foot away from it, and he looked up at her, and she looked back at him with the same steady attention she'd been giving him for the past 2.5 hours. He ate. The corridor exhaled. Petra found she had stopped writing anything on her clipboard. She didn't know when that had happened. It was 10:17 when Wren's interference became a problem. By that point, Mara had been in the isolation room doorway for over 40 minutes. Ranger had eaten. He hadn't approached further, hadn't retreated back to the corner, hadn't made the acute aggressive sounds that had defined the past 6 days. He was lying down with his head on his paws, watching Mara the way a dog watched someone they were still deciding about, cautious and intent and not yet closed. Progress. Visible, undeniable progress, which was apparently intolerable. "This needs to stop," Wren said. She said it to Reeves, who had returned at 10 o'clock, taken one look at the scene, and settled in to observe with the carefully neutral expression of a man recalibrating his entire assessment of a situation. She said it at volume in the corridor, standing far enough from the open door that Ranger wouldn't hear her, or so she apparently believed. "The liability exposure on this is enormous," Wren continued. "She's sitting in an open doorway with an unrestrained animal that is officially under a destruction order. If he—" "Wren," Reeves's voice was quiet, "attacks her, or anyone in this corridor, we're looking at litigation that could—" "Wren," slightly less quiet. She stopped, looked at him. "Lower your voice." Come, Callum." "I said lower it." He glanced at the doorway, at Ranger, at Mara's back. "This is working. Whatever it is, it's working. We're observing." Wren's jaw tightened. "You're letting an uncredentialed—" "She's credentialed. I checked the paperwork properly this time." He looked at Wren in a way that closed the subject. "We observe." For a moment, Wren stood very still, the way people stood when they'd been handed a decision they disagreed with and were deciding whether to fight it in public. Then she turned and walked to the far end of the corridor and stood there with her arms crossed, watching. Petra documented the exchange. Quietly, fully. Inside the room, Mara had finally moved past the threshold. She was sitting now just inside the door, 3 feet from Ranger, and she had her hand resting flat on the floor between them, not reaching toward him, just present, available, not demanding. Ranger was watching her hand. Then he stood up, and the whole corridor held its breath. He took 1 step, another. His head lowered, nose extending toward Mara's hand. She didn't move, didn't encourage, didn't make a sound. His nose touched her fingers. She turned her hand over, very slowly. He stood there for a long moment. Then he lay back down, this time closer. This time, close enough that when his eyes closed briefly and then opened again, he was looking at her from within touching distance. Gordon said something under his breath in a language Petra didn't recognize. "What did you say?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Nothing." His voice was rough. "Nothing. It was 11:43 when Wren made her move. She waited until Reeves had stepped away to take a call. Family medicine issue, nothing to do with the wing, the kind of administrative pull that happened to everyone at the worst moments. She waited until Petra was updating her documentation notes, and Gordon had gone back to his rounds. She waited until the corridor had thinned out to 2 staff members who weren't paying close attention. Then she walked to the isolation room door. She didn't go inside. She stood in the doorway, which Mara had finally vacated, and she looked at Mara sitting on the floor with Ranger resting 3 feet away, and she said in her crisp, authoritative charge nurse voice, "Ms. Voss, I need you to step out of the room." Mara looked up. "I need you to step out now. We're going to let the duty veterinarian take over from here. You've done what you were asked to do, the animal is calm, and he's not going to stay calm with a handoff." Mara's voice was low, controlled. "Not yet. He needs more time before you can—" "That's not your decision. I'm the assigned trauma." "You're a civilian nurse," Wren said, and somehow she made those two words carry the weight of a final judgment. This is a military working dog under a formal medical review protocol. The duty veterinarian is Dr. Seun Aroora, and she's been on call since this morning, and she's more than capable of... Has Dr. Aroora worked with a combat K9 in acute grief response before? A pause. That's not relevant. It's completely relevant. Mara stood up, slowly, carefully. Ranger's eyes open, tracked the movement, stayed with her. If you bring in someone he doesn't know right now with that energy, you're going to undo 3 hours of work and put Dr. Aroora at risk. Are you suggesting I don't know how to... I'm stating a fact about the dog. Mara's eyes were steady. Grief response in a working K9 is not the same as standard behavioral aggression. The protocol for it is different. I know the protocol. Let me finish the process. Ren's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Your paperwork is from regional command. That's administrative authority, not clinical authority. You have no formal veterinary qualifications. You have no standing in this wing's medical hierarchy. And quite honestly, I don't know what you do have qualifications in. She reached for Mara's bag. It was a small gesture, an attempted point probably, a way of demanding the credentials that hadn't been satisfactorily produced. But her hand gripped the strap on Mara's bag and pulled. Mara's arm moved with it, turned instinctively, and the motion shifted her sleeve. The fabric rode up to her forearm. For a fraction of a second, Petra, who had come back into the corridor to see why it had gone so quiet, saw what was there before Mara pulled her sleeve back down. A tattoo. Military. Not decorative. The kind with meaning that was specific and earned and not for general display. Ren had seen it too. Her hand released the bag strap. For a moment, the two women looked at each other. Mara's expression was still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. The contained quality had changed, become something less like patience and more like a door that was deciding whether to open. I'm finishing this, Mara said quietly. You can document your objection and take it to Reeves. That's your right. She turned back to the room. Behind her, Ren stood with her hand still slightly extended, staring at the place on Mara's arm where the sleeve had ridden up and then come back down. Ranger was on his feet. He hadn't lunged. He wasn't growling. He was standing, alert, his amber eyes fixed on Mara with an attention that was different from what it had been an hour ago. Not the cautious surveillance of an animal deciding whether to defend itself, but something else. Something that made the muscles in Petra's chest tighten in a way she couldn't immediately explain. He recognized her. That was the only word for it. Not first contact, not cautious familiarity. Recognition, like something buried had surfaced. Mara said nothing. She simply walked back to her place on the floor, sat down, and rested her hand on the linoleum between them. Ranger lay down. His head moved to her knee. Ren stood in the corridor with her clipboard and her years of institutional authority and the expression of someone watching the ground shift beneath them and not yet understanding why. Petra wrote everything down. Her pen was moving before she consciously decided to let it. Petra's pen kept moving for another 30 seconds after Ren walked away. Then she stopped and read what she'd written and realized she had transcribed not just the clinical events, but the expression on Ren's face, the angle of Ranger's head, the specific way Mara's sleeve had fallen back into place, details that had no business being in a medical observation log, and everything to do with the fact that Petra's brain had registered something significant and didn't yet have language for what it was. She crossed out the last 4 lines, kept the rest. The corridor had thinned to almost nothing by noon. The administrative woman with the clipboard had left somewhere around the time Ranger had eaten. Whether from relief or disappointment was unclear. Gordon had gone back to post-op. Kevin was at his station. The security officer had been quietly stood down by Reeves when he returned from his call and assessed the situation with the careful economy of a man who'd spent 3 decades making fast decisions in rooms where fast decisions cost or saved lives. What was left was this: Mara, sitting on the floor of the isolation room with a military working dog's head on her knee. Petra, standing in the corridor with a clipboard she'd mostly stopped using, and the particular kind of silence that settled over a space when something that was supposed to go catastrophically wrong had instead gone quietly, stubbornly right. You should eat something, Petra said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. She wasn't sure what she expected. dismissal probably, or that contained non-answer Mara had been giving people all morning. Instead, Mara said without looking up, "There's a granola bar in the front pocket of my bag." Petra found it, passed it through the doorway. Mara took it with a brief nod, broke off a piece, and ate it while keeping her other hand still on the floor near Ranger. The dog didn't react to the movement. His breathing had slowed to something that resembled sleep without quite being it, the shallow, surface rest of an animal that wasn't ready to fully let its guard down, but had stopped fighting the exhaustion. "How long has he been awake?" Petra asked. "Probably most of 6 days." Mara's voice was quiet. Not sad, exactly, just direct. "They do that. When something's wrong and they can't fix it, they stay vigilant. It's not a behavior problem, it's loyalty that doesn't know where to go anymore." Petra wrote that down. Not for the record, for herself. She almost asked the next question, and then didn't, because Reeves appeared at the end of the corridor moving with purpose, and beside him was someone Petra hadn't seen before. A woman in scrubs with a tablet under her arm, who carried herself with the specific confidence of someone who had credentials and knew exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Dr. Seuna Daora, presumably. The duty veterinarian. Petra moved back a step, instinctively. Reeves stopped outside the room and took in the scene. Mara on the floor, Ranger resting, the changed quality of the air in the corridor. Something in his face shifted, the same small recalibration Petra had seen twice before, but this time it went a different direction, more complicated. "We have a situation," he said to Mara quietly. She looked up. "The destruction order." He paused. "It was submitted to administration before your intervention this morning. The approval process is..." It moved faster than expected. "I've been trying to hold it, but the committee chair..." He stopped, glanced at Adaora. "There's going to be a formal review in 2 hours." Mara was quiet for a moment. Ranger's ear twitched at the change in tone around the doorway, but he didn't lift his head. 2 hours, she repeated. "The committee needs documented evidence of behavioral change. Not anecdotal, not observational. Clinical documentation of reduced threat indicators, recorded vitals if possible, and a formal risk reassessment signed by a licensed medical authority." He looked at her. "Which you are not." "I know what I am." Dr. Adaora can do the risk assessment, but she needs access to the animal, and right now, that needs to happen without a stranger walking in with a tablet and a cold entry. Mara glanced at Adaora. The veterinarian met her eyes with the measured look of someone who had come prepared to be annoyed but was revising her position in real time. "Give me 20 minutes with Dr. Adaora before she enters. I need to brief her on what's working and what isn't. Then we do a slow introduction." Reeves looked at Adaora. Adaora looked at Mara. "What happened the last time someone entered without the slow introduction?" 12 stitches, Mara said. "Or 6. Depends who you ask." Adaora nodded once, short and firm. 20 minutes. The briefing happened in the corridor, close enough to the door that Mara could hear any change in Ranger's state, but far enough to talk without disturbing him. Petra stayed because nobody told her to leave, and because at this point she had committed to the narrative of this day whether she'd intended to or not. What Mara told Adaora wasn't what Petra expected. She didn't use clinical jargon. She didn't cite literature or reference protocols. She spoke about Ranger the way someone spoke about a person they had spent a long time observing. Specific, detailed, occasionally uncertain. He holds the left ear lower when he's about to escalate. He broke eye contact with me twice this morning, both times toward the corner where his handler's vest is. There's personal gear in there. Someone should have cleared it, but didn't. He responds to a specific 2-beat signal, but I don't know yet if that's handler-specific or if he was trained to it broadly. Adaora was taking notes on her tablet. Actual notes? Not performative ones. "The vest," she said. "What personal gear?" "I didn't go through it. It wasn't my place." "But you think it's affecting him?" "I think he can smell it from anywhere in the room, and I think until someone addresses that, his grief response is going to keep getting re-triggered no matter how settled he seems." Mara paused. "That's not my call to make. That's military property, and it needs to go through the right channels." "I can flag it? Flag it fast. You've got 90 minutes before the committee review." Adaora looked at her for a moment. How do you know so much about working dog grief response? Mara ate the last piece of her granola bar. Experience. That's not an answer. No, Mara agreed. It's not. Adaora held her gaze for another second, then looked back at her tablet. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people who had just established a working respect without needing to fully understand each other, which was sometimes more useful than understanding. The introduction went slowly, and it went well. Adaora moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been properly briefed and actually listened to the briefing. Low body posture, no direct eye contact on entry, equipment hidden under one arm rather than extended. Ranger watched her the way he'd watched everything, with total attention and open threat assessment. He didn't escalate. He didn't approach. He watched. That was enough. Adaora completed her assessment from 6 feet away, and it took 11 minutes, and when she walked back out into the corridor, her expression was the expression of someone who had written a very different report than the one they'd come in expecting to write. I can support the revocation, she said to Reeves. The behavioral indicators for active threat are significantly reduced. He's in a grief response pattern, not an aggression pattern. Different treatment protocol, different outcome projection. She paused. I'm adding a recommendation that the handler's personal effects be formally processed and removed from the isolation environment. Reeves nodded slowly. Then he looked at Mara. The committee still needs the documentation by 1:15. Then we have 70 minutes. Mara looked at Petra. Petra looked down at her clipboard. At the hours of notes she'd been taking without fully realizing how detailed they'd become. The timestamps, the behavioral observations, the specific sequences. I documented everything, she said. Mara looked at her properly for the first time all day. Not the brief glances of someone accepting a granola bar or acknowledging a question, actually looked at her with the particular attention she'd been giving Ranger. Assessing, deciding. Good, she said. The documentation took 45 minutes, and it was not a clean process. They worked in the break room 2 corridors away from the isolation ward. Petra's notes spread across the table, Adaora's tablet beside them, Mara writing longhand on hospital stationery because apparently she preferred it, and nobody had time to argue. The report needed to meet 3 different sets of standards simultaneously: hospital medical protocol, veterinary clinical assessment criteria, and a military working dog welfare framework that Adaora pulled up on her tablet and that Petra had never seen before. Mara knew all 3. Not theoretically, operationally. She cross-referenced requirements without looking them up, caught a gap in Adaora's risk assessment language, and corrected it with the specific terminology the military framework required, and at one point rewrote an entire paragraph of Petra's observational notes with the kind of precision that made Petra look at her own original text and feel embarrassed. How do you know the military documentation standards? Adaora asked at one point, not aggressively, genuinely puzzled. Mara didn't look up from the page she was writing. I used to fill them out. As a veterinarian? No. Adaora waited for more. It didn't come. She went back to her tablet. Petra said nothing. She was watching Mara's hands as she wrote, the way she held the pen, a particular callus on the outer edge of her right palm from long-term grip conditioning, a scar across 2 knuckles that was old enough to be fully healed and specific enough to be intentional. The kind of scar you got from training, not from an accident. She said nothing about this either. They finished the report at 1:08, 7 minutes to spare. It was Reeves who carried it to the committee, which was the correct procedural move, and also Petra suspected a quiet acknowledgement that a man with his institutional standing presenting the documentation carried more weight than a civilian with a visitor's badge and a borrowed floor. He didn't say this. He just took the report and walked. The 3 of them went back to the corridor. Ranger was sleeping, actually sleeping this time, the slower, deeper rhythm of an animal that had finally let the exhaustion win. His side rose and fell. In the angle of afternoon light through the corridor window, he looked smaller than he had this morning. Not diminished, just, finally, briefly, at rest. Mara stood outside the open door and watched him sleep, and for the first time all day she let something show on her face that wasn't control. It was brief and complicated, and Petra filed it away without comment. He's going to be okay, Petra said. She meant it this time differently than Mara had said it this morning. not as a clinical assessment, but as the thing you said to someone who needed to hear it even if they already knew it. Mara glanced at her. Yeah, I mean it. The report was, I know. She paused. You did good work today. The documentation. It was not a grand compliment. It was the kind of thing you said to someone whose work had actually mattered, and you wanted them to know it without making a production out of it. Petra felt it land somewhere in the chest the way those small, specific acknowledgments sometimes did. Then Wren came back. She arrived at 1:31, which was 23 minutes after she'd been told the documentation had been submitted and while the committee was still in review. She wasn't alone. She had Kevin with her, which was odd, and she was carrying a folder, which was worse. Petra's stomach dropped before she understood why. I've pulled your assignment records, Wren said to Mara. The measured authority in her voice had returned, recalibrated, loaded differently than it had been this morning. Less frustration, more certainty. The voice of someone who had found something. The transfer order from Regional Command, I put it through the formal verification system at 11 this morning, not Kevin's preliminary check, the formal system. Mara turned from the doorway. And, Reeves said from behind Wren, he'd returned from the committee without Petra noticing. He was standing 10 feet back, arms crossed, face unreadable. The order is legitimate, Wren said. The assignment is legitimate. She opened the folder. But the records attached to it are flagged. Specifically, she pulled out a single printed page. The credential history listed for Mara Voss, civilian trauma specialist, regional command transfer. She held it out. Not to Mara, to Reeves. There's a discrepancy. Reeves took the paper, read it. His expression changed. Petra looked at Mara. Mara was looking at the paper in Reeves's hand with an expression that was impossible to decode. Not fear, not guilt, not defiance. Something much quieter than all of those. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like someone watching a thing they knew was coming, finally arrive. What kind of discrepancy? Aurora said from the other side of the corridor. Wren looked at Mara. The civilian record shows 11 years of trauma nursing, standard placements, 2 commendations. A pause. But before those 11 years, there's a gap, 7 years. No employment history, no educational records, no documentation of any kind. She looked at Reeves. A 7-year gap in someone's professional record doesn't just happen. The corridor was very quiet. Unless, Wren continued, those 7 years are sealed. Reeves lowered the paper slowly. Military service records, he said. Not a question. Wren nodded once. Everyone looked at Mara. She didn't look away. She stood in the doorway of the isolation room with Ranger sleeping behind her, and she looked back at all of them. And for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something moved across her face, fast and complicated and gone almost before it registered. She answered it. Voss? A pause. Then, yes, sir, I'm here. Another pause, longer, her jaw set. Understood. She lowered the phone. Who was that? Reeves asked. Mara looked at the far end of the corridor, where a door to the hospital's side entrance had just opened. A man in uniform walked in. Not scrubs, not a lab coat, not the business casual of hospital administration. A military dress uniform, ribbons and all, with the bearing of someone who did not need to announce themselves because their presence was announcement enough. He was followed by 2 others in operational dress, and all 3 of them moved through the corridor with the specific purposefulness of people who knew exactly where they were going. The one in front scanned the hallway once, passed over Reeves, passed over Wren, passed over Petra, and stopped when his eyes reached Mara. He walked straight to her. And then, in the corridor of Harlow Veterans Medical Center, in front of a charge nurse who had spent all morning trying to remove her, and a doctor who had spent all morning trying to manage her, and a nurse who had spent all morning watching all of it, he stopped and came to attention, and saluted. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranged things. Wren's folder slipped from her hand. She didn't notice. The folder pages scattered across the linoleum, and nobody moved to pick them up. Petra counted 3 full seconds of silence before anyone breathed audibly. The man in dress uniform held his salute with the practiced stillness of someone who had done it 10,000 times. And Mara, who had spent the entire morning being dismissed, managed, questioned, and cornered, stood in the doorway of the isolation room and returned it. Clean, precise, the movement of a body that remembered exactly how. Then she dropped her hand and said, "Colonel Harwick, Lieutenant Voss." His voice carried without effort, the kind of voice trained to project across noise and distance. He lowered his salute. "I got the call an hour ago. Regional Command said you'd engage the situation personally. There wasn't another option on the table that was going to work. There rarely is with you." He said it without judgment, which was somehow heavier than if he'd said it with irritation. He looked past her at Ranger, sleeping in the room behind, held that look for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite grief, but proximate to it. "How is he?" "Stable. Finally eating. He needs structured recovery time, and the handler's personal effects need to be formally processed and removed from the isolation environment. Dr. Adaora has the specifics." Harwick nodded once, slowly. Then he looked around the corridor, at Reeves, who was holding the credential discrepancy paper with the careful stillness of a man who had just realized he was standing in a room that was larger than he'd thought. At Wren, whose folder was still on the floor. At Petra, who had stopped pretending to write anything. "Who's the charge physician?" Harwick asked. Reeves stepped forward. "Dr. Callum Reeves, emergency wing attending." He didn't extend his hand. Neither did Harwick. "We weren't informed there would be a military presence today beyond the original transfer order. That order was for Voss's assignment. Our presence today is," Harwick paused, choosing the word with deliberate care, "supplementary." "To what end?" Harwick looked at him for a moment. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm. "Dr. Reeves, how much do you know about the service record of the person you've had sitting on your hallway floors all morning?" Reeves said nothing. "Because I'd suggest," Harwick continued, "that before you answer any more questions about what authority she does or doesn't have in this facility, you read the full file." He looked at one of the two people who'd come in behind him, a younger officer, captain's insignia, carrying a sealed document folder. "Daniels!" Daniels stepped forward and held the folder out to Reeves. Reeves took it, didn't open it immediately. "You don't have to read it in the hallway," Mara said. Her voice was flat, not unkind. "There's a conference room on the second floor." "I'm aware of where the conference room is," Reeves said. "Then use it." She turned back to the isolation room. "I need to stay with the dog until Adaora confirms the behavioral hold is stable enough for a supervised handoff." Harwick looked at Reeves. The look said, "She's right, and you know it, and you can have your read of the file and your feelings about all of this simultaneously." Reeves looked at the sealed folder in his hand. Then he walked toward the stairwell. Wren stood very still in the middle of the corridor. At some point, she had retrieved her folder from the floor, but she was holding it against her chest now like a shield that had already proven ineffective. "Go," Mara said, without turning around. Wren went. Harwick stayed. He stood in the corridor outside the isolation room with the two junior officers behind him, and he watched Mara return to the floor beside Ranger, and he said nothing for a while. Petra, still present and still technically on observation duty, watched him watch her and tried to construct a theory from the available information. What she had? A salute, a first-name basis, a sealed file that had made Reeves go pale and quiet, and 7 years of sealed records. What she didn't have? The connecting tissue. The thing that explained how a woman in a worn gray jacket who'd been handed a visitor's badge at 6:15 in the morning had just been saluted by a man with enough rank on his collar to make hospital administration rethink their furniture arrangement. Ranger stirred, lifted his head at Harwick's continued presence in the doorway, then tracked to Mara, then settled again. Not indifferent, calibrated. He was reading the room the same way Mara read it, Petra realized. Both of them monitoring, both of them deciding, both of them operating on a frequency that the rest of the corridor wasn't quite tuned to. "The committee's going to rule in the next 20 minutes, Harwick said. "Daniels confirmed before we came in." "I know," Mara said. "If they don't revoke the order, they'll revoke it." "Mara." She looked up at the use of her first name. Something shifted between them. The formal register dropped by 1 gear, the professional distance narrowed just enough to carry weight. The documentation is solid, she said. Adora's risk assessment is clean. The behavioral indicators are all in there, time-stamped, cross-referenced. She paused. If they don't revoke it based on that record, then the record isn't the problem. Harwick was quiet for a moment. And if the record isn't the problem, then we find out what is. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at Petra for the first time since he'd walked in, a direct, assessing look that lasted about 2 seconds and felt considerably longer. You're the observing nurse? Petra Calloway. Yes, sir. Your documentation went into the committee report? Yes, sir. He held her gaze for another second. Then he said, Good, and looked away. Petra wrote good in her notes and then felt slightly ridiculous and crossed it out. The committee ruled at 1:58. The ruling came not by announcement, but by the specific quality of Reeves's footsteps when he returned from the second floor, measured, deliberate, the controlled pace of a man who had read something that changed his coordinates and was recalculating while moving. He stopped outside the isolation room door. The destruction order is revoked, he said, effective immediately. Ranger is transferred to supervised recovery protocol pending formal military rehabilitation assessment. He looked at Mara. Dr. Adora will coordinate with your unit on the handler effects processing. Mara nodded once. Reeves had the sealed folder under his arm. He had clearly read a significant portion of it. His face was doing the specific thing faces did when they were committed to not showing what they'd just processed. The muscles a fraction too controlled, the gaze a degree too steady. There are things in that file, he said carefully, that I should have known before this morning. Probably, Mara said, but that's not how sealed records work. No. He was quiet for a moment. You could have told me. At some point. It would have made you treat me differently. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was matter-of-fact in the way that made the statement land harder than an accusation. I know. Reeves looked at her. The careful neutrality in his expression shifted, cracked slightly at one edge, the way material cracked under sustained pressure. Not catastrophic, but definitive. The structural acknowledgement that something had given way. The dog is stable, Mara continued, before he could formulate whatever he was building toward. That's what matters today. Yes, Reeves said. It is. He walked past Harwick with a brief nod. Harwick returned it. The silent exchange of two men who outranked each other in different systems and were both aware of it. From inside the room, Ranger had moved. He was sitting up, watching the doorway with the alert but non-defensive posture he'd arrived at over the last hour. High-value attention, not threat assessment. His ears were forward. His head was tilted at the specific angle that meant he was processing something auditory with interest rather than alarm. Mara looked back at him. Okay, she said quietly. Just the one word. His tail moved, a single stroke, then stopped, like he wasn't quite sure yet if that was appropriate. Okay, she said again. It moved again, twice this time. Petra had to look away for a moment at the supply shelf on the opposite wall, which was interesting to nobody until she had her face under control. The problem arrived at 2:34 in the form of a man Petra had never seen before. He came through the administrative entrance on the east side of the wing, which was the entrance used by hospital leadership and board members, and the specific category of visitor who didn't use the front desk because they'd never had to. He was 60 or close to it, dressed in a suit that said money the way some suits said effort. And he had with him a woman carrying a laptop and a man who was clearly legal counsel from the aggressive set of his shoulders and the way he was already looking around the room like it was a deposition. His name, as Petra would learn in the next 10 minutes, was Garrett Olson. He was on the hospital board. More specifically, he was chair of the Risk Management Subcommittee, which was the committee that had, until 40 minutes ago, been processing the destruction order paperwork as a liability clearance action. He did not look like a man who had come to congratulate anyone. He looked like a man who had received a phone call that interrupted something he'd rather have been doing and had come in person because some situations required presence. He found Reeves in the corridor near the nursing station, and they spoke for approximately 90 seconds, quietly enough that Petra couldn't catch the content. What she could catch was the way Reeves's posture changed, the set of his jaw, the brief, almost imperceptible stiffening that said, "This is a complication I didn't anticipate." Then Olson looked down the corridor at the cluster of people near isolation ward. B. His gaze landed on Harwick's uniform, moved on, landed on Mara. He started walking toward them. Harwick saw him coming, said nothing, but his feet shifted slightly, weight redistributing, the subtle postural change of someone who had assessed an approach and decided how to receive it. Mara didn't look up from the doorway until Olson was 10 feet away, at which point she turned and looked at him with the same expression she'd been giving everyone all day. Open. Still. Completely unintimidated. "Ms. Voss," Olson said. He had the voice of a man used to rooms that quieted for him. "I'm Garrett Olson. I chair risk management for this facility." "I know who you are," Mara said. She glanced at Reeves. "The committee ruled." "The medical committee ruled," Olson said. "The board hasn't." A pause. "The destruction order was entered as a formal liability clearance," he continued. "That makes it a board-level document, not just a medical one. Revoking it requires board sign-off in addition to the committee recommendation." He paused, letting that land. "I came in personally because there appear to have been some procedural irregularities in how this intervention was conducted. Uncleared entry protocols, undisclosed service background, an observation record compiled by a nurse without veterinary qualifications." "The observation record is clinically sound," Adaora said from across the corridor. "Sharp, clean, not loud." Olson glanced at her. "Dr. Adaora, your assessment is part of the record. It's under review." "Under review by whom?" "The board's medical consultant." "Who is?" A beat. "Dr. Fenwick." Adaora's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Petra filed it away. "The board review will take," Olson started. "How long?" Harwick said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. Olson looked at him, at the uniform. Did the calculation that men like him always did when they encountered institutional authority that outranked their own in a category they weren't prepared for. 48 hours, Olson said. No, Harwick said. A pause. Olson's legal counsel shifted. Colonel, the animal is a military working dog under active service designation. The revocation of a destruction order on military working assets is not subject to civilian board review timelines. Harwick's voice hadn't changed register at all. That's not a negotiating position. It's Title 10. Olson looked at his legal counsel. The counsel leaned in and murmured something. Olson's jaw worked. The original order was entered through civilian medical channels, he said. That gives the board legitimate oversight. The original order was entered in error, Mara said. Ranger is not a civilian medical liability. He's a service animal suffering a documented grief response. The clinical record shows it. The military record confirms it. She paused. The board reviewing that isn't oversight. It's delay. I'm not interested in your characterization of, then be interested in the documentation. She stepped back from the doorway. Come look at the dog. The offer landed oddly in the corridor. Olson blinked. I'm not going to, not to interact with him, just to look. Her voice was level. You came down here to assess a liability. Look at the liability. Olson looked at Reeves. Reeves looked at the floor with the expression of a man choosing not to contribute. Then Olson, with the stiff, reluctant movement of someone accepting a dare they couldn't back down from without cost, walked to the doorway. Ranger looked at him. He didn't growl, didn't move from where he was sitting, 3 feet back from the door, relaxed but present. He looked at Olson with the direct, uncomplicated attention of an animal assessing a stranger, and then he looked away. Not threatened, not threatening, simply uninterested in the politics of the corridor. Olson stood there for a long moment. He's been 6 days in crisis, Mara said behind him. He's been awake for most of it. He's grieving a handler he watched leave and never come back. And the first thing this facility did when he started struggling was write a paper to have him killed. She wasn't angry, she was just stating the record. The documentation revokes the order because the order was wrong. The board can review the process afterward. Right now, Ranger needs the order off the table so treatment can actually begin. Olson was still looking at the dog. Ranger looked back, once, then put his head down on his paws. Something in Olson's posture changed. Not a collapse. He wasn't built for collapse, but a loosening at the shoulders, the kind of physical concession that the brain made before the mouth caught up. 48 hours becomes 24, he said. I can push through an emergency board review by tomorrow morning. 18 hours, Harwick said. By 10 a.m. A silence. 18 hours, Olson said finally. He turned and walked back toward the administrative entrance. His counsel followed. At the end of the corridor, he stopped briefly, looked back. Not at Harwick, not at Mara, at the isolation room door. Then he left. The rest of the afternoon moved differently, not easier. There were forms, military transfer documents, a phone briefing Harwick took in the conference room that lasted 40 minutes, a second visit from Ataora to complete Ranger's full veterinary intake. But the frantic, compressing quality of the morning, the sense of an hourglass running out, was gone, replaced by the slower, more durable weight of process. Petra had been officially relieved of observation duty at 3 o'clock. She stayed anyway. Reeves saw her in the corridor at 3:45 and said nothing, which she took as permission. She'd called down to post-op twice to check on Dubois and Reinhold. Dubois had been complaining about the lunch, which meant he was fine. Reinhold had slept through most of the afternoon. At some point in the mid-afternoon, Gordon appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without comment. She accepted it without comment. They stood in the corridor and watched Mara work, slowly, incrementally, extending the boundaries of what Ranger would tolerate, never pushing, never rushing, operating on a timeline that was entirely his. She was military, Gordon said eventually. Apparently. Combat. That's what the file suggests. He drank his coffee. How long? 7 years sealed, before the civilian nursing career. Gordon was quiet for a moment. K9 units. Don't know the specifics, but she knew the signals, the commands he responded to. Yes. He turned his cup in his hands. Ren's going to have a problem. She already has one. I mean, officially. He glanced at Petra. She tried to physically remove a sealed record military specialist from an active intervention to bring in an unprimed substitute. If Ataora had entered that room cold this morning, I know. Someone else goes to urgent care. Maybe it's Ataora. I know, Gordon. He drank his coffee. You documented it. I documented everything. He nodded once, the nod of someone who understood exactly what that meant and what it was going to mean later. Good. The corridor was quieter now. The cluster of curious staff had dispersed over the course of the afternoon as the situation downgraded from crisis to process. The security officer was gone. Kevin had gone back to his station hours ago. The administrative woman with the clipboard had never returned. What remained was Mara, Ranger, Harwick speaking quietly on his phone at the far end of the corridor, Adora completing her intake notes on a chair near the nursing station, Petra, and Gordon, and the specific hard-won stillness of a room where something bad had been prevented by a margin that nobody wanted to calculate too precisely. At 4:17, 3 things happened in close enough sequence that later Petra would remember them as simultaneous, though they weren't. The first was that Mara reached into Ranger's vest. She'd been working up to it for 2 hours, small, incremental encroachments on his personal space, each one given time to normalize before the next. She had his trust now, or something close enough to it for practical purposes, the provisional trust of a damaged animal deciding that one specific human was safe. When she reached for the vest, he stiffened. A full-body alert, ears up, breath held. She stopped, waited, didn't retreat. He exhaled. She reached again. Inside the vest, her fingers found something. She pulled it out slowly. A patch. Military unit insignia. Specific, small, the kind that got handed between service members in the field as a marker of shared experience. On the back, in permanent marker, someone had written 3 words in handwriting that was cramped and precise and clearly belonged to someone who'd written a lot in difficult conditions. "She'll find you." Mara held it for a long time. Ranger watched her face. She closed her hand around it. The second thing that happened at 4:17 was that Ren Nakamura returned to the wing. She had changed her scrubs, which told Petra she'd been off floor for several hours. Whether in HR, in a conference room, or somewhere else entirely was unclear. She walked to the nursing station, picked up a chart, and was in the process of behaving as though the morning had not happened when Reeves materialized from the direction of the conference room. He said her name once. She turned. "My office," he said. "Now." His voice was not loud, and it was not angry, and it was more serious than either of those things would have been. Ren looked down the corridor. At Mara. At the isolation room. At Petra, who happened to be looking directly at her. Something crossed her face. Not contrition, not yet. Closer to the specific discomfort of someone who had been certain all day and was only now beginning to reckon with the cost of that certainty. She followed Reeves. The third thing that happened at 4:17 was that Harwick walked to the isolation room doorway, looked at Mara, and said quietly, "They need you to brief command at 0800 tomorrow." Mara looked up. "Not a request," he said, not unkindly. She nodded. Then she looked back at the patch in her hand, at the 3 words written by a soldier who was gone, and she said, "His name was Corporal Danny Varga." Harwick was quiet. "He was 24, Mara said. "He'd had Ranger for 3 years. He used to write letters to his mother every week, even when he was in the field." She paused. "She doesn't know yet that Ranger is here. She doesn't know She doesn't know about the order." "Mara, someone should call her." She looked up. "I'll do it if command won't." Harwick held her gaze. "I'll make sure it gets done through the right channels. Tonight." "Tonight." He held out his hand. After a moment, she placed the patch in it. He closed his fist around it and stood there for a second with the specific stillness of a soldier, holding something that carried weight beyond its size. Then he straightened. "Get some rest when this hand's off. You've been on since before 06. "I'm aware." He looked at Ranger. The dog had settled back into his resting position, but his eyes were open, watching Mara with the steadiness of an animal that had made a decision and was holding it. "He looks better," Harwick said. "He'll look better in a week," Mara said, "and better than that in a month. It's not fast with grief. It's just work, and..." The handoff to overnight supervision happened at 5:30. Aurora had sourced a second veterinary nurse from the facility's animal therapy program, a quiet, methodical woman named Suarez, who listened carefully while Mara briefed her, asked 3 specific and useful questions, and positioned herself outside the isolation room with the unhurried competence of someone who understood that her job tonight was presence, not intervention. Mara briefed her for 15 minutes, every signal, every response pattern, the 2-beat call and what it meant and when to use it and when not to. The vest was out of the room now, bagged and tagged and in Harwick's custody. Without it, Ranger's hypervigilance had dropped another visible degree. The constant low-level rerouting of his attention toward the corner where it had sat was gone. He ate again at 5:15. Properly this time, not the cautious test eating of the morning. With appetite. Adora noted it with the careful neutrality of a professional trying not to let relief color a clinical record. It colored it slightly anyway. Petra stayed until 5:45, when Gordon told her she was going to fall over if she didn't leave and eat an actual meal, which was accurate enough that she didn't argue. She collected her notes, all of them, the full day's documentation, and walked to the elevator. She stopped at the corner of the corridor. Mara was standing outside the isolation room one last time, not in the doorway, just outside it. Ranger had moved during the handoff to lie near the door, as close to the threshold as he could get while still inside the room. His nose was at the gap below the door. Mara crouched down. She put 2 fingers in the gap, low to the floor. His nose pressed against them. She held that for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up her bag, and walked. Petra stepped back around the corner before she reached it. Not deliberately, just an instinct toward the privacy of the moment. She heard Mara's footsteps pass. Heard them pause. "Calloway." Petra came around the corner. Mara looked at her, tired now, genuinely, visibly tired in a way she hadn't shown all day. The kind of exhaustion that only surfaced once the sustained effort of the day had been set down. "The documentation," Mara said. "All of it. Make copies, physical and digital. Keep one set off-site." Petra looked at her. "Why?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved down the corridor in the direction of Reeves's office, where Wren had gone and not yet emerged. "Because," she said, "some people don't accept rulings gracefully." She held Petra's gaze for a second longer. Then she walked to the elevator. Petra stood in the corridor with her notes against her chest and looked toward Reeves's office and listened to the distant, indistinct sounds of a conversation she couldn't quite make out, and felt the particular unease of someone who had been told something important in a language they hadn't finished learning. She pulled out her phone. She took photographs of every page of her notes. All of them. She was on the 14th page when the door to Reeves's office opened and Wren walked out. Her face was composed in the precise way that meant it had required effort to compose it. She walked past the nursing station without stopping, past Kevin without looking at him, toward the staff locker room. She stopped at the corner, turned, looked directly at Petra. Neither of them said anything. Then Wren continued walking, and the hallway absorbed her footsteps. And Petra looked back at her phone and finished photographing the last 3 pages with hands that were not entirely steady. At 6:40 in the evening, Harwick's junior officer Daniels found Petra at the vending machine on the 2nd floor. She hadn't eaten since a half sandwich at 7 that morning. She was standing in front of the machine with money in her hand trying to make a decision and failing, the specific cognitive flatness of someone who had spent 12 hours in sustained alertness and now couldn't choose between pretzels and a granola bar. Daniels was professional and direct, and in approximately her age range, and clearly used to delivering information to people who weren't expecting it. "Miss Calloway, the colonel asked me to give you this." He handed her a card, military contact information on one side, handwritten number on the other. "If anything happens tonight or tomorrow related to the documentation or the case file, you call that number directly." Petra looked at the card. "What would happen?" Daniels held her gaze. "We're not anticipating anything, but Ms. Voss flagged your observation record as a primary evidentiary document in the military's case record for Corporal Varga's service dog, which means it has formal standing now." "Formal standing," Petra repeated. "Which means some people might prefer it didn't." Petra looked at the card. "Keep your copies," Daniels said. He nodded once, the efficient nod of someone whose message had been delivered and received, and walked back toward the stairwell. Petra bought the granola bar, stood at the window at the end of the 2nd floor corridor and looked out at the parking lot, where Harwick's vehicles were still present, which was either reassuring or not depending on how you looked at it. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She opened it. 4 words. "Board meeting called. Tonight." No name, no context. Petra read it twice. Then she pulled up her photographs and counted the pages. 17 total, full documentation, time-stamped, complete, and forwarded them to her personal email and to the number Daniels had given her. She pressed send, and then her phone rang. Not the unknown number, not Daniels, not Reeves. It was Wren. Petra stared at Wren's name on her screen for 2 full rings before she answered. "Calloway." Silence on the other end. Not dead. She could hear ambient noise, a hallway, the distant sound of a door. Then Wren's voice, stripped of the crisp authority it carried on the floor. What replaced it wasn't weakness exactly. It was the sound of someone who had spent 8 hours being certain and was now standing in the wreckage of that certainty trying to figure out what to do next. "The board meeting tonight," Wren said. "You got the text?" "Yes." "It's not what you think." Petra leaned against the window. Outside, the parking lot lights were coming on in the early evening gray. "What do I think?" "That I called it. That this is me trying to overturn the ruling." A pause. "I didn't call it. Olson did." Petra said nothing. "I need you to know that," Wren said. "Whatever happens tonight, I didn't make that call." "But you knew about it." A longer pause. "Yes." "How long?" The silence stretched. In it, Petra heard the specific hesitation of someone deciding how much truth they could afford. He called me at 4, after he left the wing. 4 o'clock. 50 minutes after the revocation was confirmed. 50 minutes after Olson had stood in the doorway looking at Ranger and agreed to the 18-hour timeline. He'd called Wren 40 minutes later and apparently told her something worth calling about. What did he say? Petra asked. He said the committee ruling was procedurally compromised, that the documentation had been compiled by an uncredentialed observer, meaning you, and that doctor. Adaora's assessment relied on methods introduced by a specialist whose record contained, his word, inconsistencies. Another pause. He said the board had grounds to override the committee on liability basis. He's using your interference this morning, Petra said. Not accusingly, just following the logic where it went. Your attempt to remove Mara and bring in Adaora without briefing, he's framing it as evidence of procedural irregularity, which makes the whole morning look contested. Silence. Is that what he told you? Petra asked. He told me the board needed testimony from staff who were present. Wren's voice was stripped down now, the way voices got when people stopped performing composure. He told me my account of the morning would be useful. There it was. Petra closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. Outside, a military vehicle was still parked in the lot, steady and dark. Wren, she said, are you calling me because you want to give him that testimony, or because you've decided you're not going to? The silence this time was the longest one. I don't know, Wren said, and the fact that she said it that plainly, without the institutional armor that had characterized every word she'd spoken all day, told Petra more than a decisive answer would have. Where are you right now? Staff parking, in my car. Stay there, Petra said. Don't call Olson back tonight. Don't confirm anything. Just stay where you are. Callaway. The documentation is already filed with military command. Time-stamped. Harwick's office has copies. Whatever Olson builds tonight, he's building it against a record that's already in federal custody. She paused. If you testify for him, you're on record against a federal case file. If you don't, you're a witness who declined. Those aren't the same thing. A long silence. How do you know all that? Wren said. Daniels told me. Harwick's officer. Petra looked at the card in her hand. Mara flagged my notes as primary evidentiary documentation, which means this stopped being a hospital matter the moment Harwick's unit took custody of the file. She heard Wren exhale, a long, slow breath, the kind you took when a structure you'd been holding against pressure finally cracked all the way through. I've worked in this facility for 11 years, Wren said. It wasn't an excuse. It was something more complicated than that. The articulation of a thing she'd built, and was only now seeing had been built on assumptions she hadn't examined. I know, Petra said. I was wrong this morning. Yes. I don't... She stopped. That's not something I say often. I know that too. The line was quiet for a moment. The board meeting is at 8, Wren said. Olson's pulling Fenwick in as medical consultant. Dr. Marcus Fenwick, he's the board's retained physician. He was going to review Adaora's assessment for procedural compliance and... She stopped. And what? And Fenwick and Reeves have history. Professional history, not good history. Wren's voice had returned to something closer to its normal register. Not authority, but precision. The part of her that was useful when she wasn't pointing it in the wrong direction. If Fenwick gets in front of the board with Reeves's documentation, he's going to find something to question. He always does. Petra was already dialing Daniels on her other line. Wren, write down everything Olson said to you. Times, exact words as close as you can remember. Send it to this number. She read out Daniels' contact. Tonight, before 8. That's... If I do that, You're a witness making a voluntary disclosure. That's different from the other thing you could be. Petra picked up her granola bar and her notes. And Wren, it's the right thing. She hung up before Wren could find another way to hesitate. She reached Daniels on the second ring. He listened without interrupting, which was the professional courtesy of someone trained to intake information before responding. When she finished, he said, Board meeting at 8. Fenwick as consultant. Olson soliciting staff testimony. Yes. And Nakamura? She's deciding. A brief silence. Forward me everything she sends you immediately when it arrives. I'm calling the colonel. There's also the Fenwick Reeves history Nakamura mentioned. I don't know the specifics. I'll find them. He was already moving. She could hear it in the background sounds, the specific ambient shift of someone transitioning from stationary to in motion. Miss Calloway, go home. I'm not going to... Go home, eat something, and keep your phone on. You've done what you need to do today. A pause. Voss would tell you the same thing. Petra stood at the window for another moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. She took the long route past Isolation Ward B. Suarez was in position outside the door, a cup of tea on the chair beside her, a clinical observation form on her clipboard. Through the reinforced window, Petra could see Ranger lying near the door, the same position he'd held when Mara left, as close to the threshold as the room allowed. His breathing was visible and slow. His eyes were closed. Suarez glanced up, nodded at Petra. Petra nodded back and kept walking. He tipped. The board meeting started at 8, and Petra knew nothing about what happened inside it until 10:23, when Daniels called. She was at her kitchen table with actual food in front of her for the first time since 6 that morning, her phone face up beside the plate. She'd showered, changed, done all the ordinary things that felt slightly unreal after a day like the one she'd had. The domestic continuity of a life proceeding normally around an event that had not been normal. She answered on the first ring. Olson withdrew the board challenge, Daniels said, at approximately 9:40. The meeting adjourned. Petra set down her fork. Why? Colonel Harwick addressed the board directly at 8:30, laid out the federal standing of the military case file, confirmed that any board action to override the revocation would constitute interference with an active military welfare investigation. A pause. He was characteristically persuasive. And Fenwick? Doctor. Fenwick reviewed the documentation, asked 2 procedural questions, received answers he couldn't argue with, and declined to enter a formal objection. Daniels's voice was even. Nakamura's disclosure arrived at 7:50. It was comprehensive. Something in Petra's chest loosened that she hadn't realized had been tight since the parking lot. Olson? She asked. Withdrew voluntarily. At this point, the investigation is in military custody, and any further interference on his part would carry federal implications he's not interested in. A brief pause. His legal counsel was apparently very clear with him about that. Is it over? Daniels was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing precision over speed. The board challenge is over, the revocation stands. Ranger stays under the recovery protocol. Another pause. The hospital side review of what happened today. That's going to be a longer process. Meaning Wren. Meaning Reeves's documentation of the morning. Meaning the formal account of what Wren had done and why and what its consequences had nearly been. Understood, Petra said. Get some sleep, Miss Calloway. He ended the call. Petra sat at her kitchen table for a while after that. The food cooled. Outside, her street was quiet. She thought about Ranger lying by the door of the isolation room with his eyes closed, and about 3 words written in cramped handwriting on the back of a military patch, and about the specific way Mara had held it before she handed it to Harwick. She ate the cold food, went to bed. She didn't sleep particularly well, but she slept. The morning brought 3 things before 8 a.m. The first was a text from an unknown number that she would later confirm was Mara. Briefing done. Board result confirmed. Thank you for the notes. No punctuation on the last sentence, which somehow made it feel more like Mara than any formal phrasing would have. The second was a message from Reeves, sent to her work email at 7:15, with the subject line, Documentation Review. Calloway, P. It was 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed that her observation record had been formally incorporated into Harlow's internal case file and that she would be asked to participate in a staff review process scheduled for the following week. The second paragraph was shorter and said, essentially, that her conduct throughout the previous day had been exemplary and that the emergency wing was fortunate to have her on it. She read that second paragraph twice. Reeves was not a man who wrote things he didn't mean. He was also not a man for whom those words came easily. She understood both things and felt the weight of them accordingly. The third thing was Gordon, calling her at 7:52. "You need to come in early," he said. No preamble. "My shift doesn't start until... Wren's not coming in today. Reeves put her on administrative leave pending the review." A pause. "It's not quiet in here." Petra was already looking for her jacket. Hush. She understood what Gordon meant by not quiet when she walked through the wing at 8:20 and felt the specific atmospheric change of a workplace that has processed overnight information and is now recalibrating around it. In practical terms, this meant conversations that stopped when she rounded corners, the deliberate non-eye contact of people who were deciding where they stood, and Kevin at the nurse's station wearing the expression of someone who had known Wren for 3 years and was currently figuring out what that meant now. "How's he doing?" Petra asked him, dropping her bag behind the station. Kevin knew she wasn't asking about Dubois. Suarez said stable overnight, ate again at 6, took water without prompting. He pulled up the overnight notes. She documented him resting within 2 feet of the door the whole night. "Still looking for her." "Looks like it." Kevin glanced down the corridor toward Ward B. "Doctor, Adora is coming in at 9 for the first formal rehabilitation session. Mara Voss isn't... She's not on today's schedule." "She's at command. 0800 briefing." Kevin nodded, turned the overnight notes toward her. "There's something else." She looked. At the bottom of Suarez's overnight documentation, in the section for additional observations, was a single line written in neat clinical handwriting. 0347 hours. Subject vocalizing. Not distress. Closest behavioral match. Low register content vocalization. Duration 4 minutes. Cease spontaneously. No intervention required. Petra read it twice. Content vocalization was the term for the sounds dogs made when they were dreaming or processing, or simply existing in a state that wasn't crisis. The sounds of an animal that had somewhere, under the weight of 6 days of acute grief, found a small pocket of something that wasn't pain. She handed the notes back to Kevin. "Okay," she said. "Yeah," he said. She went to check on Dubois, who was complaining about the breakfast, which meant he was fine. By done. The review process formally began at 10. It wasn't a single meeting. It was the beginning of a documentation and interview sequence that the hospital's HR director, a careful, methodical woman named Flores, explained would take approximately 2 weeks and involve every staff member who had been present in Isolation Corridor B at any point on the previous day. Flores was not from the wing. She had the specific neutrality of someone brought in specifically because they had no stake in the outcome, which was the right call, and also slightly unnerving in the way that all competent neutral parties were unnerving when you were not certain you'd done everything right. Petra gave her statement in a small conference room on the 3rd floor at 10:30. She had her notes. She had her time-stamped photographs. She had the clear linear memory of someone who had been writing things down in real time all day and had not been able to stop thinking about them since. She told it straight, all of it. Wren's attempts to remove Mara, the grab for the bag, the sleeve. The moment Ranger responded before anyone in the corridor fully understood what they were seeing. Olson's arrival, the board challenge, the phone call in the parking lot, all of it, in sequence, with times attached wherever she had them. Flores wrote steadily, asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them precise and relevant. At the end, she looked at Petra over her notepad. "You stayed on voluntary observation past your assigned duty period." "Yes." "Did anyone ask you to?" "No." "Why did you?" Petra thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, part professional instinct, part the simple human compulsion to see a thing through that you'd been present for from the beginning, part something she didn't quite have language for, that had to do with Mara sitting on the floor and Ranger pressing his nose through the door gap. "Because it mattered," she said, "and I could." Flores noted it, closed her folder. "Thank you, Nurse Calloway." Petra walked out into the hallway and ran directly into Reeves. Not literally. He was standing in the corridor outside the conference room in the way that suggested he'd been aware of the approximate timing of her interview and had positioned himself accordingly. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. They stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking. Fenwick withdrew from the board's retained consultant list this morning, Reeves said finally. As of 9 a.m., submitted his resignation via email. Petra looked at her coffee. Was that expected? No. A brief pause. He and I had a professional disagreement 4 years ago. A serious one. I assumed he was at the meeting to revisit it by other means. He held his cup in both hands. He apparently read the case file, concluded the board challenge was without merit, and removed himself rather than be part of it. He paused again. People can surprise you. Yes, Petra said. They can. Reeves looked at her, not the assessing look of the attending physician managing a situation. Something more direct than that, less mediated. I made assumptions yesterday, he said. About Voss. About what kind of person walks into a situation like that, and what they're likely to know and not know. He held her gaze. I wasn't the worst person in the room, but I didn't. He stopped. The sentence didn't have a good ending, and he knew it. You let her work, Petra said. Eventually. That was enough. He looked like he wasn't sure he agreed. The board of a former patient is looking into filing a complaint against Olson personally for misuse of board authority in the service of personal liability management. He set it to his coffee cup. That's not connected to anything I did or didn't do. It's a separate process. But I thought you should know. Petra nodded. And Nakamura's leave is pending the review. Whatever comes out of that process, I'm not predetermining it. He looked up. But the record is the record. Yes, Petra said. It is. He nodded. Walked back toward the wing. Petra drank her coffee in the corridor and looked out the window at the morning and thought about records and what they were worth and how much they depended on the person standing beside the moment being willing to write things down. Mara came back at 2 in the afternoon. Petra was in post-op, updating Dubois' chart. He was being moved to a standard room later that day, which he was complaining about even though it was an improvement, when Gordon knocked and said, "She's back," with the specific economy of someone who knew exactly who he meant. Petra finished the entry, capped her pen, walked to the corridor. Mara was not in her gray jacket today. She was in civilian clothes, different ones, dark pants, a plain blue shirt, her hair down. She looked like the same person in a lower operational register, the way people looked when they were off duty but hadn't quite fully left. She was talking to Adaora outside Isolation Ward B. Not the clipped urgent briefing of the previous morning, a longer conversation, the kind where both people had time and were using it. Adaora had her tablet out and was showing Mara something on it, and Mara was nodding and asking questions, and between them there was the easy, functional communication of 2 people who had decided they could work together. Petra watched from the end of the corridor. At some point, Adaora gestured toward the isolation room door, and they both turned to look through the observation window. Petra couldn't see Ranger's exact position from where she stood, but she could see both women's faces as they looked through the glass. Adaora's was professionally measured. Mara's was something that wasn't professional, something that landed differently, quieter and more personal, the expression of someone looking at a thing they had pulled back from a very specific edge. Gordon materialized at Petra's shoulder with a coffee for himself and nothing for her, which was typical. Adaora says he took treats from her hand this morning, he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. Ranger did? From Adaora, not just from Mara. He sipped his coffee. That's significant, apparently. Means the trust transfer is working. He's not going to be a one-person dog in recovery. He'll be workable. Where does he go after this? There's a military rehabilitation facility in Virginia. Adora's been on the phone with them this morning. Gordon looked at the isolation room. 60 to 90 days there, then reassessment for service or retirement. Can he do service again, after everything? Gordon was quiet for a moment. Some of them do. Some of them retire. The ones that do service again. He paused. They say those dogs often become the best handlers' dogs, because they've already been through the worst thing and they know they survived it. Petra thought about that. Down the corridor, Mara had turned from the observation window and was now looking directly at her. She didn't wave. Neither did Petra. But Mara gave a small nod. The specific one she'd given after the granola bar, after the documentation compliment. Precise and real and enough. Petra nodded back. The formal staff review meeting happened on Friday of the following week. It was not the dramatic institutional confrontation Petra had half expected. It was 2 hours in a conference room with Flores, Reeves, 2 representatives from hospital HR, and the medical director, a sparse, attentive man named Dr. Osei, who had read every page of the case file before he sat down and showed it. The findings were presented in sequence. Flores read them without editorial comment, which was the right call. What they found was Mara Voss's assignment and credentials had been legitimate and properly filed. The credential gap reflecting sealed military service records accessed only upon formal military inquiry. Her methods, while outside standard protocol, had been clinically effective and were supported by subsequent veterinary assessment. Petra's observation documentation had been compiled in good faith and with professional accuracy. Adaora's risk assessment was sound. What they also found was Ren Nakamura had made multiple interventions that exceeded her authority and had introduced unnecessary risk to both the animal and to a specialist whose sealed background she had not known when she attempted the handoff. The attempt to bring in Dr. Adaora without proper briefing, specifically, had been identified as the single action most likely to have resulted in serious injury if it had proceeded differently. Ren's leave was converted to a formal disciplinary record. She was removed from emergency wing charge duties pending a reassignment review. She would not be fired. The review made clear this was a determination made in light of her 11-year record and the absence of malicious intent. But she would not be in a position of authority over emergency wing protocol for the foreseeable future. She wasn't in the room when the findings were read. Nobody had expected her to be. Olson received a separate letter from the board regarding his conduct. Petra didn't see the letter, but Kevin, who had a source on the administrative floor that nobody asked too many questions about, said it was the kind of letter that attached itself to a personnel record and made certain future decisions very straightforward. After the meeting, Reeves walked with Petra to the elevator. "You're going to be asked to participate in a revised protocol development process," he said, "for military working dog cases in VA-adjacent facilities." He pushed the elevator button. "It'll take time. Probably a year before anything formal is codified." He paused. "Voss is involved in the development. I imagine you'll be working with her again." Petra looked at him. "You're recommending me?" "Your documentation was the only complete contemporaneous record of an intervention that's now being discussed at a federal level as a model for how these cases should be handled." He said it evenly. "It's not a recommendation, it's a fact about what you did." The elevator opened. "Dr. Reeves," Petra said. He looked at her. "What was in the sealed file?" He held the elevator door. A long pause. The pause of someone deciding how much to say about something they'd been carrying for a week. 7 years, he said. 4 overseas deployments. Combat trauma specialist embedded with K9 and special operations units. She developed the field recovery protocols that are currently used for both service animals and their handlers across 3 branches. He paused. She was medically separated. Honorably. The specifics are sealed further than what I saw, but the work she did is still being used, every day. He let the elevator door close. Petra rode down alone and thought about 7 years of a life that had been folded up and placed beneath 11 more, and about a woman who had spent an entire day in a hospital corridor being questioned about her qualifications by people who would never have the patience to ask the right question. She was doing chart updates and post-op on Thursday afternoon. Reinhold had finally been upgraded to full recovery status and was being discharged Friday, when her phone showed a number she didn't have saved. She answered. "It's Voss." Petra set down her pen. "How's the briefing circuit?" "Extensive." A pause. "Ranger is being transferred to the Virginia facility on Monday. Gordon told me. 60 to 90 days. Something like that. A beat. I'm going down there for the first 2 weeks of the transition. They want me present for the initial adjustment period." "Makes sense." After that, Mara paused, and there was something in the pause that felt deliberate, like she was making a decision mid-sentence. After that, I've been asked to consult on the protocol development process. Reeves already told you, probably. He did. I'll be in Colorado Springs for at least part of it. Another pause. Adaora's involved. She's good. She is. Silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who had said most of what they needed to say and were acknowledging it. Your notes were good, Mara said. I mean that. Not just useful. Actually well written. You're the second person in a week to compliment my documentation. Get used to it. They're going to be referenced in federal training materials. A dry note in her voice that might have been the closest thing to humor Petra had heard from her. Your name on a federal training document. Worse fates. Considerably, Petra agreed. The line was quiet for another second. The patch, Mara said. And the register changed just slightly, the professional tone dropping a half step into something that didn't have a clinical name. Harwick made the call to Corporal Varga's family, his mother, last Tuesday night. How did she take it? She asked to see Ranger, eventually, when he's further along in recovery. A brief pause. Harwick thinks it's a good idea. So do I. Petra thought about a woman receiving a call about a dog she'd probably heard her son mention, the way soldiers mentioned their canine partners, casually and constantly, and with the particular unguarded affection people showed for things they trusted their lives to. She'll come, Petra said. Yeah. Mara's voice was quiet. She will. The call ended a few minutes after that, practical and clean, no drawn-out goodbyes. Petra put her phone down and went back to the chart and wrote Reinhold D. Discharge Friday, full recovery status confirmed, and underneath it, in the section for attending notes, added a line about observed progress and positive indicators that was slightly more detailed than strictly necessary, and she left it in anyway. She was finishing the last chart of the afternoon shift when Flores appeared in the doorway of the post-op nursing station. Calloway. She was holding a folder. Her expression was the expression she'd had during the review process. Neutral, precise, but carrying something. Do you have a moment? Petra capped her pen. Yes. Flores entered and closed the door behind her. She set the folder on the desk and looked at it for a second before she spoke. This is outside the formal review scope, she said. Technically, I'm not here, but... She opened the folder. Inside was a printed email chain, 6 messages long. Olson has filed a counter-complaint against the military case file, specifically against the evidentiary standing of your observation record. Petra looked at the email chain, at Olson's name at the top of it, at the words procedural irregularity and uncredentialed documentation and civilian observer without veterinary qualification. He's filing it through the hospital's legal office, Flores continued, arguing that because you're a human trauma nurse documenting a veterinary intervention, the record has no formal evidentiary standing in the military case. She paused. If that argument succeeds, it doesn't undo Ranger's revocation. That's locked in federal custody, and it's untouchable. But it does potentially affect the protocol development process. The federal training materials. Your name on them. Petra looked at the emails for a long moment. When did this come in? She asked. This morning. Flores's neutrality had the quality of someone who was not neutral, but was choosing neutrality on principle. Military Council hasn't received it yet. They will by end of business today. She paused. I wanted you to know first. Petra looked at the top email, at Olson's name, at the careful, legally worded argument that was built on a technically true foundation. She was not a veterinarian, she had no veterinary credentials, she had documented a veterinary intervention. All true. All built in complete ignorance of what she'd actually documented, which was not a veterinary case at all, but a human grief response that happened to be expressed through an animal, which was exactly what Mara had said from the beginning, in the first conversation she'd had in this building, standing at Kevin's desk with a visitor's badge clipped crooked to her collar. He doesn't understand what the notes say, Petra said. Flores looked at her. He's calling them veterinary documentation. They're not. Petra picked up the folder, read the top email again. They're trauma documentation, human trauma response, grief, acute behavioral withdrawal, stimulus hypersensitivity. Every term in my notes is from human trauma literature because that's what Mara was working from. She set the folder back down. If he challenges them as veterinary documentation, he's arguing against the wrong record. Flores was quiet for a moment. Can you demonstrate that? She asked. I can write a one-page annotation of every clinical term in my observation record with its source literature and field of origin. Petra looked at her. Human trauma, combat grief response, PTSD behavioral indicators adapted for nonverbal subjects. She paused. It'll take me 2 hours. Military counsel will need it before they receive Olson's filing. Then I need a desk and 4 hours. Flores picked up the folder, held it for a second. I wasn't here, she said. I know. She left. Petra pulled out her chair and sat down and opened her laptop and started pulling her notes from her email archive, and she was 7 minutes into the annotation when her phone lit up with a message from Mara's number. Olson filed. I know, Harwick knows, write the annotation. Then a second message, arriving 30 seconds after the first. Also, Olson's legal counsel this morning, the woman who was with him on Wednesday. A pause. Then a third message. She used to work for the firm that handles VA medical liability cases in this district, until last year when she left under circumstances that are currently the subject of a state bar inquiry. Petra stared at her phone. Harwick's legal team found it this morning, Mara wrote. I don't know yet what it means for Olson's filing, but I thought you should have it. Petra set the phone face down on the desk. She looked at her annotation document, at the blank page waiting for words. Then she looked at the door of the nursing station, closed and ordinary, and thought about a woman who had spent a day being dismissed and had spent the days since quietly, methodically, ensuring that every piece of the record was exactly where it needed to be, and had, apparently, still not stopped. She picked up her pen. She started to write. And then the door to the nursing station opened, and the person standing in it was not Flores, not Gordon, not anyone she expected. And the expression on their face said that whatever Petra thought the last complication was, she had been wrong. It was Wren. Not the Wren who had stood over Mara in the corridor with a clipboard and 11 years of institutional certainty. Not the Wren who had grabbed a bag strap and exposed a tattoo she hadn't been meant to see. This version was wearing civilian clothes, dark coat, no badge, which meant she had come in through the front entrance as a visitor, and she had come deliberately, and she had found this specific room, which required asking someone where Petra was, which required a decision. She looked like a person who had made several difficult decisions in the last 48 hours and was standing at the edge of one more. I need to tell you something, Wren said. Petra gestured to the chair across the desk. Wren sat, looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up. Olson called me this morning, she said, before he filed. Petra waited. He wanted me to sign a supplementary statement confirming that the observation process was irregular, that I had raised concerns about your qualifications in real time. She paused. Which is technically true. I did raise concerns. What did you tell him? I told him I needed to think about it. Wren looked at the desk. And then I drove here instead. Petra looked at her carefully. Wren was not comfortable. Discomfort was not something she wore naturally, and it showed. She sat with the residual posture of someone who had spent years being the authority in a room and was now occupying a chair in someone else's space, and couldn't quite resolve the contradiction. He told me his legal counsel had identified a procedural argument that would separate your documentation from the military case file, Wren continued. He said it was clean, that it wouldn't affect Ranger's revocation, but it would... She stopped. He made it sound like a technicality. Administrative housekeeping. It's not a technicality, Petra said. It's an attempt to invalidate the evidentiary foundation for the federal protocol development process, which would set back standardized care for military working dogs in VA-adjacent facilities by, I don't know how long, years possibly. Wren was quiet. He's not trying to save the hospital from liability, Petra said. He's trying to limit the exposure of the specific decisions he made last week. The board challenge, the attempt to override the committee ruling. If the federal record doesn't hold, the investigation into his conduct has less to stand on. Wren said it flatly, like she'd already worked it out, and had come here because she needed to say it out loud to someone who would confirm the calculation. I know. Did you sign the statement? No. She held Petra's eyes. I came here instead. Petra looked at her annotation document on the laptop screen, at the half-written first paragraph. Then she looked at Ren. I'm writing a technical annotation of my observation record, establishing that every clinical term in it is sourced from human trauma literature, not veterinary. It would take 2 hours alone. She paused. You were a charge nurse for 11 years. You know the literature. Ren looked at the screen. Something moved across her face, recognition, and then the particular weight of someone understanding exactly what they were being asked and why they were being asked it. An hour, Ren said, with 2 of us. 50 minutes if we're efficient. Ren took off her coat and hung it on the back of the chair, then stopped talking. They finished the annotation in 47 minutes. It was not a comfortable collaboration. There were 2 moments when they disagreed on specific sourcing and 1 moment when Ren corrected a citation that Petra had referenced from memory and gotten slightly wrong. And the way she said the Whitmore-Sally's framework, not Whitmore-Jensen. Their different papers was exactly the clipped professional voice that had stood over Mara in the corridor, but pointed, this time, in the right direction. Petra forwarded the completed document to Daniels at 5:17. Daniels replied in 4 minutes. Received. Forwarding to counsel now. This is exactly what was needed. She showed Ren the message. Ren read it, nodded once, put her coat back on. At the door she stopped. Didn't turn around immediately, just stood there with her hand on the doorframe, looking at the hallway. I went into nursing because I was organized, she said. It came out like something she'd been working up to. Good at systems. Good at knowing how things were supposed to go. A pause. I was always the person who knew where the line was. What was protocol and what wasn't. Who belonged and who didn't. Petra said nothing. I looked at Mara Voss and I saw someone who didn't have the right paperwork and I decided everything from there. Her voice was even, but underneath it was the rough grain of genuine accounting. The dog was in crisis and I spent 3 hours trying to remove the one person in the building who understood what was wrong with him. You stopped, Petra said, when it mattered. Barely. Still counts. Ren turned then, looked at Petra with the particular expression of someone who hadn't been offered that kind of uncomplicated acknowledgement in a while and wasn't sure what to do with it. The review board, she said. My reassignment. I'm not fighting it. I know. I think that's... She paused. I think that's probably the most honest thing I've done all week. She left. The door closed quietly. Petra sat for a moment in the empty room. Then she opened a new document and started writing up her own account of the last 10 days. Not for any formal process, just for herself. The kind of writing you did to close something out, to put it in language you could hold still and look at. She wrote 2 paragraphs and stopped. It wasn't ready yet. Some things needed more distance before language could hold them. She saved it and closed the laptop. Olson's filing was formally rejected 6 days later. The rejection came from the military's legal division and ran to 11 pages, of which Daniels summarized 3 key findings in a message to Petra. The observation record had been correctly classified as human behavioral trauma documentation and fell within the scope of clinical nursing competency. The challenge itself had been found to constitute an interference attempt against an active military welfare investigation, and the record of Olson's conduct over the relevant 10-day period, the board challenge, the legal counsel's bar inquiry, the attempted solicitation of staff testimony, had been referred to the state medical board for review of his hospital board membership. The last part had not been in Harwick's original scope of action. It had, Daniels mentioned in a brief follow-up call, emerged as a natural consequence of the full picture. Petra read the summary at the nursing station on a Tuesday morning while Kevin was updating the shift board and Gordon was eating an apple at the far end of the counter. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her bag, and went to check on her patients. Dubois had been discharged. Reinhold had been transferred to outpatient follow-up. She had new patients. The work continued, the way work always continued, imperfectly, incompletely, with new problems arriving before the old ones were fully resolved. But the record was the record, And Olson, who had built an 11-page argument on the idea that a nurse's documentation didn't count, was now the subject of an 11-page rejection that would be attached to his professional record for as long as that record existed. There was a justice in that, quiet and administrative and completely real. Boy, she didn't hear from Mara for 2 weeks. Then, on a Thursday afternoon at the end of October, her phone showed that number again. "Ranger's doing well," Mara said without preamble. "I heard from Aurora. She's in contact with the Virginia facility. He took commands from a new handler yesterday. Voluntary. First contact." A pause that carried something. Not quite pride, something that ran alongside it. "He's going to be okay." "You knew that on day one." "I had a strong hypothesis." A dry note. "There's a difference." Petra smiled at her paperwork. "When are you back?" "Protocol sessions start in 3 weeks. Colorado Springs." A pause. "I'm going to need your annotation document as a foundation text for the training materials." "You can have it." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. "Varga's mother is coming to see Ranger next month, at the facility." Mara's voice was quieter. She asked if she could bring something, a photo, of him and Ranger together early on. Petra thought about a woman looking through photographs of her son, finding one where he was 20-something and grinning, with a dog that trusted him completely. "That'll be good for both of them," she said. "Yeah." A beat. "Yeah, it will." The call ended the way their calls ended. Practical, clean, no performance of warmth that didn't already exist between the lines of everything they'd said. The protocol development sessions ran for 7 weeks. They met in a conference room at a VA liaison office 3 blocks from the hospital, a rotating group that included Mara, Aurora, Petra, 2 military K-9 welfare officers, a trauma psychiatrist named Dr. Eve Mensa, who worked with veterans and had been studying animal-human grief bonds for 12 years, and Reeves, who attended every session and said less than anyone, and whose notes, Petra observed, were the most detailed in the room. The work was slow. Real work was always slow. They argued about language and classification and scope, and what qualified as a cross-trained intervention and what didn't, and Mensa made them rewrite the grief response section 3 times before he was satisfied. And Aurora's clinical precision regularly caught things that everyone else had glossed over. Mara ran the sessions the way she'd run the isolation room, without visible effort, without dominance, just with a steady, patient insistence on getting it right that wore down shortcuts and assumptions the same way water wore down stone. On the 4th week, they reached the section on observer documentation, on who could compile a clinical record during a non-standard intervention and what training they needed and what standards applied. Mara opened the session and set a document on the table. Petra recognized it. Her annotation, the one she'd written with Ren in 47 minutes with 2 cups of cold coffee and professional friction and something that had turned out to be necessary. "This is our source text for this section," Mara said. She looked at Petra briefly. Not a long look, just the 2-second acknowledgement that carried weight precisely because it didn't oversell itself. It set the standard. We're building from it. Mensa picked it up, read the first page. "Who wrote this?" "Callaway," Mara said. "With significant contribution from a senior nursing colleague." Mensa looked at Petra over the top of the page. "You didn't have veterinary training." "No," Petra said. "But you understood what you were watching." "I was watching a grief response. I've seen grief responses. They look the same in the humans I work with." She paused. "The clinical vocabulary is the same. Why wouldn't the notes be?" Mensa set the document down, looked at Mara. "She's right, you know. This is the correct frame." He tapped the paper. "The field keeps trying to separate the animal welfare literature from the human trauma literature, and they shouldn't be separate. They were never separate." Mara looked at Petra. "I know," she said. "That's why I used it." The conversation moved on. The session continued. Petra wrote notes and argued about 2 sections and agreed with Aurora on a 3rd, and ate lunch from a box in a conference room chair at noon, and it was ordinary and unglamorous and the most purposeful she'd felt in her professional life since she tried to remember. She couldn't identify a clear before. On the last day of sessions, Mara arrived early and set something on Petra's chair before anyone else came in. A copy of the draft protocol. The full document, 112 pages. On the cover, in the field marked contributing authors, there were 6 names. Petra Calloway, RN, Harlow Veterans Medical Center, was the third one. She looked at it for a moment, at her own name in a document that would go to federal review and, if approved, into the training pipeline for every VA-adjacent facility in the Western District. It was not a dramatic moment. The fluorescent lights of the conference room were doing what fluorescent lights did. Someone down the hall was microwaving something that smelled aggressively of fish. Mara was setting up her laptop and not looking at her. Third, Petra said. Alphabetical, Mara said. Adora starts with A. Adora insisted on going after you, said you'd been there first. A pause. I didn't argue. Petra set the document back on the chair carefully, like it was something that warranted care. Ren should have been in this room, she said. It wasn't absolution, it was just true. She knew the literature, she helped write the annotation. The annotation is cited in the footnotes. Mara glanced at her. Her contribution is in the record. She'd hate that that's not enough. Yes. A pause. It's what she has. Petra thought about Ren in a reassigned position, somewhere in the hospital, doing work she was probably still good at, carrying the weight of a week that would live in her professional history as the week she had been wrong about everything that mattered. That was its own kind of consequence. Not a clean one, not a satisfying story about comeuppance, just the grinding reality of a person who had to keep showing up in a place where people remembered. Some lessons didn't come with closure. They just came. The protocol was submitted to federal review on a Friday in late November. Mara called that evening, not about the protocol. I'm staying in Colorado Springs, she said. Permanently. Mensa's unit has a trauma consultation role, K9 and veteran grief interface. A pause. It's not a military role, it's civilian, but it uses the right things. Petra looked out her kitchen window at the street, where the first real cold of the season had arrived, and people were walking with their hands in their pockets and their chins down. That's good. I haven't had a permanent posting in, Mara stopped. A long time. How does it feel? The pause was long enough that Petra thought the call might have dropped. Honest, Mara said finally. It feels honest. There wasn't much to add to that. They talked for another few minutes about Ranger. He was in the late phase of rehabilitation, responding well. The Virginia facility was cautiously optimistic about a reassignment to a training role, working with new K9 candidates rather than active deployment. A future built on what he'd survived rather than despite it. She'll find you. 3 words on the back of a patch, written by a 24-year-old in conditions Petra could only partially imagine, addressed to a dog who couldn't read them. An instruction or a promise, or both. Written with enough certainty that the soldier had pressed it into the vest and left it there because he believed the right person existed and would arrive. And she had. Not easily. Not to applause. In a worn jacket with a visitor's badge clipped crooked to her collar, standing at a desk where a 26-year-old ignored her for 4 minutes, walking into a hallway full of people who had already decided what she was, sitting on a linoleum floor while institutional authority formed a line to tell her to leave, staying anyway, staying quietly, staying until the record was undeniable. That was the thing about being certain of what you carry. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't defend itself. It simply outlasts every room that tried to dismiss it. The protocol approval came through in March. Petra was in post-op when Mara forwarded her the confirmation. No message attached, just the official subject line and the file. She opened it on her phone while standing at the nursing station, read the first paragraph of the approval document, and put her phone in her pocket. Good news? Gordon said. Working on it, she said. He handed her a coffee. She took it. Outside, the Colorado morning was doing what Colorado mornings did in March, cold and bright and indifferent to the things humans were building and breaking and slowly getting right. The hospital ran its routines. The patients in Petra's ward needed what patients needed. The work was ordinary and unfinished and mattered. Somewhere in Virginia, A dog named Ranger was learning to trust a new set of hands. Somewhere in this city, a woman who had spent 7 sealed years building something essential was finally doing it under her own name, in a permanent place, with a window she could look out every morning. And in a federal training document that would be read by nurses and physicians and K-9 welfare officers in facilities across 3 states, there was a section on observer documentation standards that began with a framework built in 47 minutes by 2 women who disagreed about almost everything except what the record required. None of it was clean. None of it arrived the way it was supposed to, through the right channels, with the right permissions, at the right time. All of it was real. The hardest thing about quiet strength is that you never get to explain it in the moment. You just have to keep carrying it through rooms that don't see it yet, trusting that the record, if you're careful, if you're honest, if you write it down, will eventually speak for itself. Petra picked up her pen. She went back to work.